It's Lucky Paper Radio. I'm your host, Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, buying buckyballs as a coping mechanism, Maddox.
Yep, that works.
How many buckyballs you got now, Anthony? What's the count?
It's a couple thousand, and technically not buckyballs, so these are some little magnet toys. They might have been banned for safety reasons, but you can buy these really tiny versions, and they're fun to play with. You can make fun magnet shapes. I would strongly recommend it.
So what makes them not buckyballs? The size? Buckyballs have to be a certain size?
Well, I mean, that was a brand name.
So that brand just got put out of business by law, basically?
Yeah.
Rude. Seems rude.
Hey, it's, this is America. You can't have magnet toys, but you can go buy a shotgun at Walmart. That's how it works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, interesting concepts on safety in this country.
You need a semi-automatic rifle for hunting purposes, but you can't have a Kinder Egg because that's candy with a toy inside. And what if dumb children just eat the whole thing and then swallow a toy?
Yeah, great question.
I guess, Anthony's against protecting children is what we're learning here.
Yeah, sure.
He's strongly anti-kid stance here on Lucky Paper Radio. This is a card game for adults.
I think creative toys, they're not a child's toy. That's fair. There's a real danger. But I also think these kinds of creative toys they just sort of set you up to develop these kind of interesting intuitions, and I think that's very valuable.
Did you know the thing about the coding that Nintendo puts on the Nintendo Switch games?
No. Oh, because those are pretty small.
Yeah, because the game cards are so small. They're maybe the size of a little bigger than a thumbnail. They're really tiny little cards.
Kind of like a delicious little cornflake is how I would describe the size of them.
Sure, exactly. Because they're so small, and because video games are for children, they have coded them in this extremely bitter, disgusting coding, which, of course, once the public discovered, YouTube is just full of nothing but people licking their Switch cartridges.
Oh my God.
Because they want to see how awful it tastes.
It's going to be so hard for me not to do that now.
Oh. Right? What the hell? It doesn't taste as bad as I thought it was going to be.
It tastes pretty bad, though.
Oh, that's just nasty. I thought it wasn't that bad at first, but then it gets worse as you keep it in your mouth.
It's like the Barbra Streisand effect, kind of, but for Switch games, I guess.
But for horrible tastes.
Anthony, there's an elephant in the room that I think we should just address right out of the gate.
I don't see it.
I've actually prepared a little written statement. So if you wouldn't mind, I'll just go ahead and read this. When you press play on an episode of Lucky Paper Radio, you're taking part in a sacred ritual, a communion between podcast listener and podcast host, built on a foundation of trust. Last week, that trust was shattered. Those of you who subscribe to this podcast and download it immediately upon release, first thing Monday morning, did not hear the dulcet, mediocre white guy with a podcast tone you've come to expect from Lucky Paper Radio. Instead, I, Andy Mangold, sounded like the unhinged fourth member of Alvin and the Chipmunks, the black sheep of the family that eschewed a career in music to dedicate his life to a children's trading card game. As the producer of this show, I am solely responsible for this horrible mistake. When I auto-tuned my frankly half-assed parody of Journey's Don't Stop Believin' in an attempt to cover up my shoddy vocals, I did not realize that my adjustment to the global key of the project from C major to E major had affected my voice track. When I was notified of the mistake by a handful of dutiful listeners, all of whom noted that, at first, they did not know if the screeching, helium-addled voice was simply another 2-bit prank, I fixed the issue immediately. Though most of our listeners never heard this deranged version of last week's episode, those who did are our most devoted and eager listeners, the people I least want to disappoint. I apologize to anyone who was subjected to this truly awful version of last week's episode. I also want to apologize to my co-host, Anthony, perfectly normal voice Maddox, for my terrible unprofessionalism, and to Steve Perry, songwriter and frontman from Journey, for butchering his iconic chart-topping hit. I cannot promise I will not make more mistakes in the future, but I can assure you that I will work hard to earn back the trust I have squandered.
I forgive you.
Thanks, buddy.
I actually thought you were going to say we were apologizing for going completely off topic again, which I don't think we should apologize for. We never made a promise. This is just a conversation between two friends, and maybe we'll talk about Magic the Gathering. Maybe we'll talk about stupid hot dogs. Who knows where this is going to go?
We are never apologizing for going off topic on this show. That's what podcasts are. It's what you signed up for. But I will apologize for the first version of the podcast last week sounding awful and being truly unlistenable. So there's that, everybody. This week, Anthony, we're definitely going to stay on topic, though, because this is, without a doubt, our Kaldheim. Do you know how to pronounce this for sure? Do you know how to pronounce it? I'm going to go with Kaldheim. This is our Kaldheim first look, I guess. We haven't gotten full spoilers yet, but we are in the middle of spoiler season. And I thought we'd talk maybe primarily about the mechanics of Kaldheim, and perhaps some specific cards will come up and we'll talk about them briefly. We'll, of course, do a more thorough review show once the full spoiler is out and we've done our whole survey and everything. But for now, I just want to kind of talk through some of the mechanics and our first thoughts on them from Kaldheim. So that is what we're doing this episode, Anthony. I'm going to keep us on track. There will be no diversions.
We'll see. Do your best.
But first, before we get there, we do have to do our Pack 1 Pick 1 from a listener-submitted cube, as we do every week on Lucky Paper Radio. Our cube this week comes to us from listener Arjan from the Netherlands. This is one of the organizers of the Cube Invitational alongside Thomas Krone, which is a long-running cube event. So people probably know Arjan and his cube. And Anthony, this cube is a cube that started as an Innistrad cube. So I suppose Arjan was really into Innistrad, thought it was a cool limited format. So it began as an Innistrad cube, and then since then has evolved a little bit over time. It's a 600-card unpowered Legacy Plus cube. And just looking at this list, I think it's kind of... I'm excited about this cube. It seems very interesting. I see a couple of cards that Arjan has broken Singleton for, which I like to see, that there's certain things that just couldn't be supported in Singleton, and so he was happy to just add more copies of a card, which I like to see that. And it seems like a cool list.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. Like, even though this cube is very much sort of moved away from that initial starting point, that kind of like nucleation point, or that sort of like initial crystal, is definitely still visible. I've been thinking a lot in terms of crystals and local maximums. I don't know if you've been playing with magnet balls as much as me, but that's where I'm at.
I don't think anyone's been playing with magnet balls as much as you, Anthony, but I share your systems thinking. So anyway, this we'll read the pack, and then Anthony's going to tell us what the top contending cards are. So pack is Kessig Wolfrun, Findhorn Elves, Murderous Rider, Lingering Souls, Liliana's Triumph, Black Sun's Zenith, Manamorphose, Desperate Ravings, Consecrated Sphinx, Muldrotha the Gravetide, Fetid Heath, Fiery Confluence, Divine Visitation, Brago King Eternal, and Flooded Strand. I still see the Innistrad inspiration present in this pack, Anthony, but it's clear from some cards we have strayed a little bit and making it sort of Innistrad plus. But what are the cards that you're looking at?
I think in terms of like just power level, the cards that are the best first picks are probably going to be Elves, Fiery Confluence, and Flooded Strand. But I kind of want to throw in Muldrotha just as this is the card that really sparks joy here.
Yeah, I think, we can kind of get out of the way. I would just take Flooded Strand here. It's a fetch. Fetch lands are very good. I'm happy to take Fixing early. A lot of these other cards are strong, but nothing is going to take me off of Flooded Strand. So we can kind of move on and maybe eliminate that from the pack just mentally. And after that, I agree. I think Findhorn Elves is a great place to start. Always happy to start with a cheap mana dork. Fiery Confluence is, the big modal red spell. So it's 2 red for sorcery, and you can choose any of these 3 modes, and you can choose any mode more than once, up to 3 times. And it deals 1 damage to each creature, 2 damage to each opponent, or destroy target artifact. So you get to do those things in any combination that is most useful to you, given the current game state. And then you mentioned Muldrotha the Gravetide. This is a cool card. So it's 3 black, green, blue, so full Sultai for a legendary creature elemental avatar. Muldrotha is a 6/6 that says during each of your turns, you may play up to 1 permanent card of each permanent type from your graveyard. So very graveyard-focused card, and Innistrad's in fact a graveyard-focused set. So kind of right at home here, even though it was printed in Dominaria.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely very format dependent. If there's a lot of efficient removal, this card is just going to eat a removal spell, but it's one of the most powerful value engines that I'm aware of.
Yeah, it's a good example of, like, if I knew this cube better and knew that this cube oftentimes played out in slow, kind of grindy games, then I'd be very happy to have a Muldrotha. And I might even consider taking it very early. I don't think I would take it over a fetch, just because if I am going to be in a deck that's going to be playing Sultai cards or other 3-color cards that I really want good fixing, so I'm still going to prioritize that fixing. But if I were to see this, third pick or something and had taken fixing early, I'd be very inclined to just try and ride that Muldrotha gravy train to victory.
Ride the Gravetide. Yeah, obviously it's a 3-color card. It's not a reasonable first pick, but we're not here to win all the time.
I do think it's worth mentioning. Some listeners are probably wondering why Consecrated Sphinx didn't get mentioned by either of us, Anthony. And this is 4 blue for a Sphinx, creature Sphinx, I assume. I'm looking at the invocation, which I can't read, so I assume it's a creature Sphinx. And it's a 4/6 flyer that says whenever an opponent draws a card, you may draw 2 cards, which is a card that a lot of people love in very powerful cubes because it's very game impacting, right? The game revolves around Consecrated Sphinx when you resolve it one way or another. In that, if it sticks, you get to draw tons of cards off of it and ride it to victory, or it revolves around Consecrated Sphinx in the sense that it gets removed and then you didn't get any value for it, and it was kind of a blowout for you.
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking at those 2 6-drops, like, obviously they both generate a ton of sort of snowballing value in the same way, and Sphinx being a monocolored card is obviously a better choice, at least this early in the draft, but I don't enjoy that card.
Yeah, seeing it in the pack and knowing this is an Innistrad cube, I'm expecting some light to medium Reanimator themes, and either Muldrotha or Consecrated Sphinx would be a fine, like, B-tier reanimation target. Like, they're not the top tier. They're not huge creatures that are going to kill your opponent in a couple swings, and they're not, a lot of the best Reanimator targets are cards that are very disruptive to your opponent. Either they can't remove the thing you reanimated, or they keep your opponent from doing stuff, and these don't do either of those things. These just kind of generate value for you. But yeah, seeing that here makes me think that perhaps there is a reanimation thing going on. But yeah, to that point, Muldrotha is worse in Reanimator because you're much less likely at the early stage of the game to have lots of permanents in your graveyard. So actually generating value off of it could be an uphill battle. Whereas, getting early Consecrated Sphinx, drawing a bunch of cards could be good. But after the fetch land, I would take the Fyndhorned Elves. I wouldn't start on Confluence this early, I don't think, personally. And I could see an argument for Muldrotha if this ends up being a very value-oriented environment.
All right, Muldrotha it is.
I do want to make a quick shout out here to Divine Visitation. This is a pet card, or perhaps a former pet card of friend of the show, Zolthix. This card, 5 mana for an enchantment, 3 white, that says if one or more creature tokens would be created under your control, that many 4/4 white angel creature tokens with flying and vigilance are created instead. So it just turns all of your token makers into Serra Angel makers, which, it's a 5 mana enchantment that doesn't affect the board, doesn't do anything immediately the turn it's played, unless you had a Planeswalker in play already that makes tokens and you can play this and then immediately uptick to make an angel or something. It's a card that asks you to build around it, but it is a pretty big payoff. Getting 4/4 angels instead of, for example, Lingering Souls tokens is a pretty big game.
Yeah, I mean, it's the most clear, like, huge, can we call it a Timmy build around?
Yes, I think it's pretty Timmy-like to want to make a bunch of Serra Angels, but in a very cool way. That's our Pack 1 Pick 1. Thank you, Arjan, for sending in your cube. If you want to have your cube featured on Lucky Paper Radio, that can happen for you. Just email it to mail@luckypaper.co and include your name, include your pronouns, link to your cube, of course. I owe some people some emails, Anthony, because Cube Cobra does not redirect your cube ID. So if you have sent us your cube in the past and you have since changed your ID on Cube Cobra, I no longer have an link to your cube because the previous link is now dead. So just a note for everybody listening. If you do change your cube ID, any links to your cube from places prior will no longer work. I got to email people and re-ask them for an updated link, but something to keep in mind. Unless you have some other proposal, I thought we would just start talking about Kaldheim by going through the mechanics. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're not super interested in just talking about, like, what are the best cards, what's the most powerful. There's plenty of Magic content like that. I think it's much more fun for us just to get into the actual mechanics and think about sort of how they play in different cube environments.
Yeah. So just going by the order that they're in here on the Kaldheim Mechanics feature article on the Mothership, the first one we have is Foretell. And Foretell is an ability on cards that basically allows you to, on your turn, you can pay 2 and exile a card from your hand face down, a card that has Foretell. And then on a later turn, you can cast it for its Foretell cost, which is less than the mana cost in all instances. Otherwise, you would just cast it for the mana cost instead of the Foretell cost. So this mechanic basically allows you to split up the cost of a card over 2 turns, although oftentimes and or all the time, the Foretell cost plus the 2 you have to play to foretell the card ends up being equal to or greater than the converted mana cost of the card itself. So you're paying a little more in sort of exchange for splitting it over 2 turns. But it does mean that you then get access to an effect on a specific turn for less mana usually than that effect would cost you on a normal card, because you've paid some of that sort of already up front. What do you think about Foretell, Anthony?
I have bad news for you. I really don't like this mechanic.
Why not?
So, I mean, ultimately all it is just a cost reduction mechanic, right? Like, you get a little bit of a cheaper spell by splitting it up in this way. It's like giving you a sort of a payment plan for your spells. But it just doesn't really interact with anything. You know, people are saying like, oh, it's cool, it's like Morph, but it's not like Morph. No other mechanics actually interact with it. It's just sort of this extra layer of managing, well, now I have these kind of like weird 2 hands. And that doesn't spark any joy for me.
Yeah, it doesn't have really any interaction with other existing Magic mechanics, aside from really fringe stuff. Like, the first thing I thought when I saw this is that, you know, we got those Eldrazi processors in the Oath of the Gatewatch and Battle for Zendikar that basically allow you to put cards an opponent owns in exile into their graveyard in exchange for an effect, and I was like, man, it sure would feel bad to have my Foretell cards ingested by my opponent's processors. Like, that would be pretty awful. But for the most part, yeah, these cards go into exile. There's very few cards in Magic's history that interact with the exile zone. So this mechanic doesn't immediately have any kind of like, it doesn't slot into a big web of other mechanics that it interacts with.
And beyond that, it doesn't really scream interesting gameplay to me. It's just sort of like the choices you actually make are just, well, do I have an extra 2 mana? Can I put this card on layaway this turn? Or maybe, you know, sequencing, like, is it worth trying to lose a little bit of tempo by setting some cards aside in order to get a big threat out faster? But I just don't see a lot of interesting play there.
I'm not as low on the mechanic as you are. I agree that it doesn't have a lot of cool mechanical interactions with other stuff in Magic just because of the way the mechanic is designed. But it's a very tempo-forward mechanic, which I appreciate, and I like that. I like thinking of how it would interact with multiple Foretell cards in your hand, where you have to decide which of these effects is most likely to be useful next in this game that I need access to, you know, reliably. Or you have to decide how much worse is it if I have to pay the full mana cost for this card versus foretelling it and trying to like sequence your plays. It's a mechanic that has to do a lot with sequencing, which I do really like. So I think the mechanic is pretty interesting, actually. I agree. None of the cool branching interactions with other mechanics, and it is kind of insular in the fact that it's a cost reduction mechanic, but one that I think makes you think about the game in a context of like having a plan and figuring out what you need to go right and how you want sort of things to go on future turns when you're deciding what cards to foretell. I agree, though. I think for cube purposes, unless you're building a cube that is focused on Kaldheim and is going to have a lot of these foretell cards, it's going to have what some people talk about is like the morph effect, where, you know, some cubes only have like 1 or 2 morph cards. And so the mystery of like, what is that card you morphed is completely lost, because anyone that knows the cube knows that's just Den Protector because you're playing green and that's the one morph card in this cube. And so I do agree that from a cube perspective, the mechanic is a bit of a bummer, because I think when it's just 1 of or like 2 of in an environment, it loses almost all of its interest, because you don't have to decide what you're going to foretell when. Again, it's just like on an early turn, do you have 2 extra mana? Can you spend that mana to advance your future game plan in a way that doesn't cost you anything right now? So
yeah, it's weird in that it's like one of the most parasitic mechanics, but not because the cards actually care about each other or interact in a positive synergistic way, but just like you said, in a cube environment, you really need a density before you actually get that meaningful amount of mystery. Yeah,
so that part is a little bit of a bummer. I do think, though, one of the things that I'm always on about with control decks specifically is, we've talked about tempo before, and we will definitely revisit tempo in the future. I've actually been kind of noodling on an article about maybe a slightly different framing of tempo to kind of make people think about it a little differently. But oftentimes, the way we talk about tempo when it comes to control is that what you're trying to do is just survive in the early turns of the game to get to a point where you can play a Wrath, play a big Planeswalker, play something that's kind of a big turning spell that basically turns the tide of the game in your favor. The nature of a control deck is you are not going to be playing anything proactive on the first couple turns of the game. And so you need something else to do with your mana, and that's where the like cheap cantrips come in so valuable, because it allows you to do something on turn 1, even on the play in a control deck where otherwise you wouldn't be able to remove something. You're not holding up counter magic in a lot of environments on turn 1, that kind of stuff. And I think here, like, the Foretell mechanic fits in nicely there, specifically on cards that want to be in control decks. I really like the idea of foretelling something early in a control deck, because on turn 2, I'm just really waiting for my opponent to build up a board so I can respond to the things I need to respond to, remove what I need to remove, and then later on getting to have a cool turn where I'm able to maybe, play a board wipe and also my Foretell spell, or, play my Foretell spell and still hold up counter magic because I, played that 2 mana earlier on in the game to get a discount on it. So to that point, the Foretell card that we've seen so far that I'm most excited about is Starnheim Unleashed, and that's basically, it's a 4-mana Sarah Angel as a sorcery, which is already pretty ridiculously pushed, and instead if you foretell it, you can, its mana cost becomes XX white, and you get X Sarah Angels. So, you pay the 2 mana up front, then later on, for an additional 3 or 5 or 7 mana, you get to, make a bunch of Sarah Angels, which I think is a card I'm very happy to see for control decks. And I feel like even in my cube, which is pretty fast, I really like to have fast aggro and very proactive decks, I think a lot of control decks will be able to find 2 mana in the first few turns of the game to, essentially suspend this, foretell it, put it in exile, and then later on get access to a big finisher at a very cheap rate.
This card also, they have a borderless version, which is, the illustration is just ridiculous. However I feel about this mechanic, I'm definitely going to be looking to get one of these for my collection.
That card is so good. It's so beautiful. Like the deep shadows at the bottom, like the fact that it like goes to such a dark shadow, and ooh, it's incredible.
It's perfect. It really, actually, the thing that this card really made me think of, actually, is that, I'm playing, my main cube is much, much lower power level. It's mostly commons and uncommons. And there's such a difference in the way, like, the illustration style is, or just the way they approach illustrating commons versus rares. Like, they want the rares to be big and splashy and exciting in the way that they play and also the way that they look. And I'm realizing, like, if I look at my cube, just a lot of the illustrations are more just like, oh, this is just generic. It's just a guy with a sword, which is
just some dude with a sword. Yeah, that card's really beautiful. That is definitely one I have earmarked for acquiring myself too.
Yeah, I'm excited to see them doing more of borderless treatments on not just planeswalkers.
Yeah. The last thing I want to say about Foretell is that it's not really, like, people compared it to Morph, which is kind of true in the sense you're paying for a thing in 2 parts, but as you mentioned, Morph has a lot more, I think, interplay with other mechanics because you're putting a thing into an interactable zone. Like, you can flicker your Morph card and then it comes in face up, and you get a 2/2, which you can do stuff with. You can bluff with Morph by morphing something that, is a land. There's that land with Morph, and it's not actually a creature in the first place. So Morph has a lot of other weird interactions. Foretell doesn't really have that. The other mechanic I think is actually similar to Foretell is actually one of my least favorite mechanics of all time, which is Echo. Echo is a mechanic that basically lets you play a spell, or almost always, it's always a permanent, pretty much always a creature, that is at a decreased rate. It's much cheaper than it should be for the effect you get. And in exchange for that, you have to, on your next upkeep, either sacrifice that permanent or pay the echo cost, which is almost always the mana cost repeated. So, you end up paying more than the cost of that effect over 2 turns, but much less the first turn, which means that some of those cards end up being very powerful. Deranged Hermit is a card that was extremely powerful in many formats for a very long time and has since been kind of power crept out of contention, but there are some really powerful Echo cards. But even when those cards are powerful, I hate playing them because that mechanic is a huge feel bad. It just feels terrible to... you get your cheap thing, which is good. That you're happy about. And the thing that really bums me out about Echo is that you have to decide before you draw your card for turn if you're going to pay the Echo cost on the permanent, which obviously is part of the balancing of it. If you got to get perfect information and know if you were going to draw something else you want to do with your mana before you pay the Echo cost, then Echo would be a lot stronger because you get to know before you decided if you wanted to keep that permanent whether or not you were going to draw something good. But the fact that you don't and you just have to, like, I don't know, I guess I'll pay for this deranged hermit, then you draw a sweet planeswalker, and you're like, oof, I just really wish I could have cast this planeswalker instead and kept my dumb little tokens. It's a real feel-bad mechanic for me.
Totally. I was thinking about exactly this, and it occurred to me, wouldn't Magic just be so much better if we just switch the upkeep and draw steps? And we've seen a lot of, like, recent design has gone in this direction where, like, Sagas trigger at the beginning of your first main, so you already know what your card is you've drawn for the turn before you make any decisions about it, which I think is just a lot better.
That's an interesting statement. I don't know if I'm ready to say that Magic will be better overall if the upkeep is after your draw step, but certainly there are a lot of things that happen on the upkeep that would be much stronger if they happened after you drew a card for turn. Echo being one of them, so.
For sure.
Anyway, I think Foretell is cool. I like tempo forward mechanics, but I certainly understand and agree with all of your points that it is not particularly interactive with other things in Magic's history, and ultimately not a very deep mechanic. Just cost reduction, over time.
I will say, now that I'm seeing more of the actual individual cards in the set, I definitely think it's going to play very well in Limited. Like, the last couple sets we've seen have all been fantastic for Limited, and I'm sure that they've packed in a lot of things that are going to make it play really well. Specifically, it does let you set up these turns where you're able to cast multiple spells in the same turn, or, just set up these more interesting specific lines of play when you have this cost reduction mechanic present. And I think it's actually just going to play out very well in Limited.
I agree. I think these cards are going to be good.
All right, what's next?
Next up is Boast. Boast is basically a category of activated abilities that can only be activated if you've attacked with this creature this turn. So basically, it's abilities on creatures that, if you've attacked with that creature, you can activate the ability. I've not seen one yet that only says it's sorcery speed, so they can all be activated at instant speed. So I think one of the primary lines will be activating them in combat. I think you will oftentimes end up throwing away less than or less important creature just in exchange to get to activate its Boast mechanic once. This mechanic is kind of similar to Raid. Raid is the mechanic that gives a card an extra effect when it is cast or when it enters the battlefield if you attacked with any creature this turn. So it's a sort of combat matters mechanic, but this one is specific to caring about the creature that actually has the Raid ability.
Yeah, I think this is going to play really well. The notable thing is we've seen a lot of similar cards. Cards have basically had this effect already, but a lot of them are triggered abilities and say when this creature attacks, you may pay a cost and do something. The fact that this is still connected to that interaction, it's still forcing you to get into combat, but then you can activate it later during combat or even in your second main phase, I think actually makes the mechanic a lot more flexible and interesting because, you don't have to say, well, I'm going to choose to pump this at the beginning of combat. You can actually wait and see how your opponent blocks and have that threat of activation be valuable.
That's actually really similar to what we just kind of talked about with the Echo. It is very similar mechanically to just a triggered ability that says when something attacks, you can do something. But oftentimes deciding at that moment feels awful. And you're just gosh, I don't want to decide right now. I want to see what happens after combat. Maybe you have something else that's going to happen in combat. It's going to give you more information. You might draw a card in combat or something, and you want to see what happens there. So yeah, it's basically a thing that it works very much like those abilities, but they're kind of lumped into this keyword that basically just says you can do this at any time later in the turn. Second main phase, end step, whenever you want. This is a pretty simple mechanic. Like you said, it's just kind of keywording a thing that kind of already exists in Magic and makes it a little different. So not a lot of interplay there, but I do like combat-focused mechanics, and I gotta say, I am looking at some of these Boast cards for Battle Box, which is a format we have not actually talked about really in depth on the show, but is a format where I specifically have a lot of combat-focused mechanics in my Battle Box, and Boast, I think, is going to slot in very nicely there.
Yeah, same thing for this multiplayer cube I've been tinkering with. It's just another good combat-focused mechanic that forces you to get into combat.
That's true, yeah, that's another great environment for this, where it's like, hey, I just gotta attack anybody with my Boast creature, which kind of, gives you a little bit of plausible deniability for the social contract of multiplayer, where it's like, why are you attacking me, man? It's like, well, I just have to trigger my thing. Nothing personal. I just gotta trigger my Varagoth demon or whatever, Blood Sky Sire.
Is that the way to think about multiplayer cube design? It's just giving players plausible deniability for trying to make reasonable choices to win the game.
I think it is actually frustratingly important in that environment, probably, yeah.
Sad.
So yeah, I think this is a cool mechanic. I like any mechanic that gives you more... activated abilities, I like them. They give you more options on the board, and this particular mechanic is only activated abilities that are contingent upon attacking, which gives you outs to bluffing, gives you outs to playing to the board in interesting ways. So I'm into this. We already saw one card that I'm super excited about for my cube with Boast, and this is the Usher of the Fallen. It's a 1-drop 2/1 that has Boast for 1 and a white. You make a 1/1 spirit token. Does it have flying? I gotta check now.
No flying.
That's just a great example of giving players the decision if they're playing a mono-white aggro deck of turn 1, they play this thing. Turn 2, they get to attack. Do you want to spend your 2 mana making a 1/1, or do you want to spend your 2 mana developing your board with other cards in your hand. That's the kind of decision I love giving my players, where it's like, the 2 mana for a 1/1 is obviously a bad rate. Like, that's not a good amount of mana to pay for a card, but you're not spending a card on it. So it's kind of like 2 mana, draw a card, make a 1/1 is like the best way to think about it. It's almost like 2 mana, make an Elvish Visionary. And depending on the matchup, depending on what your opponent's doing, deciding whether or not that's the best way to spend your mana or whether or not you want to play a regular 2-drop is the kind of decisions I really like to prioritize. So really excited about that card. I'm hoping we see a couple more cool Boast cards. I'm really looking for more Boast cards too with haste. I think it's a very cool mechanic with haste on the creature.
That's interesting. At that point, it almost feels like Kicker.
Right, exactly. At that point, it's like it lets you top deck your 2-drop or whatever, but because it's got haste and Boast, you can immediately just throw it into combat, let it get eaten by a blocker, but you get whatever effect you want from Boast, which I think, again, just cool modality. I like modality in my Magic cards, and I think Boast is a good example of that. Speaking of modality, Anthony, we have some returning mechanics in Kaldheim, and the first one is modal double-face cards, which is a mechanic I really loved from Zendikar Rising. How did you end up feeling about the modal? I know that you had mixed feelings about the modal double-face cards, mostly because in Zendikar Rising, they were all lands on the back and spells on the front, and here in Kaldheim, we're getting a lot more diversity of the modal double-face cards. So how do you feel about this?
I'm not as excited about them as most people. I think really more than modals, like modal double-face cards is kind of a weird mouthful. It's kind of feels just like an industry term. Really more they are as modal permanence. Like the issue with, we looked at Confluence. What's it called?
Fiery Confluence.
Fiery Confluence. Like, it's a modal spell.
What's it called?
That gives you a set of options. It's very hard to do that with permanence, because once you put it into play, you have to track it in some way. So it's like, it's a thing that works very well in letting you say, well, I can cast this 2 different ways from my hand, and it's going to be clear once it's in play what it is. On the other hand, I just don't really like like if you had given me Fiery Confluence and said, well, hey, would you like it if half of this text was written on the back of the card and you couldn't read it? I would say no, of course not. So like I see the value that it adds in terms of making things easier to track in the battlefield. I don't really like them, especially, when it is actually like a full other spell. It's, fairly easy to track when it's a land on the other side, but when it's just 2 distinct spells, I don't really like how that plays in the draft or just looking at it in my hand. Also worth noting digitally, like on Arena, these work totally fine. I'm not as excited about it as most people.
So is your issue with it entirely that practical consideration? Like, if we take the old split cards like Fire Ice or something, if there was a way to have it all on the front and still have it not confuse people, like, to your point, if Fire Ice was 2 permanents and you put it in play, then you immediately have the problem looking at the board of like, well, is that Fire or Ice? I can't remember which one it is.
Right, yeah.
Because it's a spell, it just happens to go to the graveyard. You don't have to worry about that. So that's why we haven't seen, I think, modal permanents like this before, because there's no way to solve that problem until they sort of introduce this technology of modal double-face cards. Is your issue with it entirely that technology, the fact that the card does have printing on both sides and there's a front and a back, and when you open it in a draft, you have to announce it because the player sitting next to you might see the back of the card and the players across the table might not? Like, is that the reason why you don't like it, or is it just that you're not excited about modal permanence in general?
No, it's just the logistical stuff you mentioned.
Yeah, fair enough. I still really like this mechanic. It does have logistical issues, and I should say too, I think the logistical issues are exacerbated in Kaldheim because in Zendikar Rising, they were all lands on the back, and except for the mythic lands, they all were just lands that came into play tapped and produced a color of mana. So once you learned that, there was no need to look at the back of the card to see what it did, right? You just knew this is a green land that comes into play tapped or whatever. Here, the fact that the back of the cards have text on them, and in some cases, a lot of text, there is going to be, flip-flopping in a draft, pulling it out of a sleeve, looking at, the back of the card and seeing what it does and trying to remember. And that is, I think, definitely weird and annoying. But that's something I'm willing to pay for in exchange for modal permanent cards, because, again, I really love modality, Anthony.
Modality is strong. But yeah, I mean, imagine you're in a world where we could actually play in paper and you have your modal double-face god and you're trying to decide, well, I know that this is an artifact that costs 1. Do I actually want to play it? Well, what are you going to do? Flip it out to let your opponent know what's in your hand, or look it up on your phone?
Yeah, that is definitely annoying for sure. In reality, what's going to happen is that a lot of these cards are really only going to be played primarily for one of their sides. I mean, it's very hard, I think, for both of the sides to be equally appealing, and so depending on the board state, depending on what kind of cube you have, there's going to be a side that is played much more frequently than another side. And so my hope is that people that play my cube regularly will know that, like, all right, well, this card, for example, one of the cards I'm most excited about in the modal double face card territory is the new God Hate Bear. I guess it's not technically a bear. It's a 3-mana 2/3 with flying and vigilance that has a line of hate about snow cards, and then it also says that non-creature spells that your opponents cast that cost 4 or more mana cost 2 more to cast. And that line of text I'm very interested in. And the back of that card, I can't even remember what it is. It's some artifact that reduces damage that would be dealt to you or permanents you control by 1. And it's like, it's a side I don't expect to get played almost ever in my environment. But the front half of that I'm very excited about. So, I don't know, I'm hoping that people end up just kind of shortcutting it to being like, well, yeah, I really want to play this side 95% of the time, or, just kind of remembering what the sides do. But it's definitely a big cost.
I think it's also worth comparing it to transform cards, which I don't necessarily feel as strongly about, because you still only cast it as one side. So when it's in your hand, when it's in the draft, like, what the card is mostly going to do. And in general, like, when you flip a transform card, it's going to be good. So it's like, here it tells us a little story. I'm going to put it in play as this permanent, and then there's this upside of maybe I'll be able to flip it. And that just feels like it really embraces the double-sidedness in a way that I think is actually productive.
That's a good way to put it, that obviously you do have to kind of know what the text on the back is, but you also don't really have to, because you're going to cast the card whenever you can based on what it does on the front side, because that's what's given to you, right, with a transform card. And then after it's in play, obviously your opponent knows it's there. Then you can look at the back all you want, and then you can decide how to sequence your plays and attack to try and actually trigger the transform condition to get it onto the backside. And yeah, it is, I think, a little more elegant that way. So yeah, I think it is worth recognizing that in Kaldheim, I think this problem is going to be at its peak compared to all of the double face cards we've ever seen, because here you do have to decide before you cast it. You do have to decide as part of the draft which side is relevant to you, and it's going to cause issues, I think, that are logistical.
On the other hand, we're not playing in paper anyway, so these problems kind of just go away.
Hopefully soon, though, Anthony. I don't know. Hopefully in the next 6 months. We'll see. We'll get there eventually.
We'll see.
I do want to make a quick note here that the showcase frame for Kaldheim, I think, is gorgeous. Do you love it as much as I do?
I really love it. Is it only on the double face cards?
Good question. I think we've only seen it on double face cards so far.
Oh no, it is. There are definitely some other cards with it. Yeah, great.
Oh, good.
I'm gonna try and figure out a way to get 1 or 2 of those into my cube, probably.
It's really quite an accomplishment. Very, very beautiful. It has big Eldraine vibes to me, which is, we've talked on the show before about how we are always happy to encourage wizards to take risks. And this is a great example of, I didn't like the showcase cards from Zendikar. I don't really like a lot of the borderless stuff they're doing in Double Masters and things like that. But I'm willing for them to take all those risks and make all those cards I don't care about and don't want, because if I let them keep taking risks, then they'll do stuff like this showcase frame, which I love. It is up there with the storybook frame from Eldraine in terms of most beautiful card frames ever. So very excited about these cards.
Speaking of new frames, snow cards are back and have a new frame.
I could be the one to grumble about this now, Anthony.
I appreciate that, because I feel like I'm being a little too negative.
Are you going to offer a foil to my negative opinion on snow, or are we just both going to be down on this right now?
We're just going to slam it.
Great. I hate snow. I think its mechanic really stinks hard. Snow is a type of basic land, which is weird. It's the only other type of basic land that exists. You can have a forest, or you can have a snow-covered forest. Those are the two kinds of forests you can have. And when snow is present in a set, the mechanic has some very interesting traits, because when you are drafting a snow set, a set with snow in it, you don't get to just put snow basics from the land station into your deck. You have to draft the snow basics in the actual packs. The last time we saw this was in Modern Horizons. And that basically introduces this new limited resource and does make the cards matter in the pack for drafting, which I think it's cool that it's a mechanic that makes the basic lands actually matter. That part is actually fine. If snow only applied in limited, I think it'd be kind of cool to actually have cards that care about basic lands.
Yeah, I mean, in limited, I think, is where the mechanic actually works really well, because it does offer you a choice. You have to draft these lands, you have to sacrifice other picks in order to really turn on these powerful cards. That's perfect, that's what you want. The issue is really just in constructed, and then the way it leaks into Cube and some of these other formats as well, where there isn't that tension. There's just not a choice. It's like, oh yeah, if I want to play this card, I just play snow basics, and that it doesn't really matter. The one trade-off maybe you're making is that you are playing basics instead of other fixing lands, but now if they're printing double or snow duels, a lot of that goes away as well. So it's just sort of eliminating choices.
Yeah, so I don't like the mechanic in theory for constructed because they're introducing some snow hate cards in this set. That God I mentioned briefly earlier does make your opponent's snow basics come into play tapped, but I'll be very surprised if any of the snow hate cards are good enough that people in constructed formats will actually put them in their sideboard in case their opponent is playing snow basics. In reality, in constructed, it's just like snow is a strict upgrade over a regular basic. And so if there's any snow cards you want to play, you just play snow basics and it doesn't affect anything, right? It's just this weird thing. And I don't like that it's a card that's basically a strict upgrade over a basic land. I mean, it's still a basic land, but it's a different kind of basic land. And really, I think the problem comes down to not just these things we're talking about, because I don't play constructed. So that's just me whining, which is not productive. But what it actually means is that the way they have to design cards with the snow mechanic, it's in this really weird conflicted space where the card has to be playable in limited if it's designed for limited. If it's a mythic rare, they don't care. But most of the snow cards are meant to be played in limited. And so they have to design it with limited in mind, where you're going to have some number of snow cards, either basics or other snow mana producing cards like mana rocks or creatures in your deck, but you're not going to have that many of them. It's a limited resource. So the snow payoff has to be pretty good there, but not so good that in constructed, where you get this for literal free, you just get to have as many basic lands that are snow as you want, that it ends up being broken. The actual snow cards end up being in this weird design space. And ultimately it's just like the worst kind of mechanic, I think, is just a cares about mechanic. Just count how many of this thing you have and you get something for it. I really don't like mechanics like that. And this one that happens to trod on the basic land space and introduce this weird question for cubes, just, I don't know, it really irks me.
On the other hand, they are doing some different things with snow here. It's not only how it relates to basic lands. I don't think we have anything that just has snow in the main cost of it. There's a lot more things where it's like, well, this cares about how many snow permanents you have, and maybe that's just other creatures. It doesn't just have to be basic lands. The more I'm thinking about it, kind of like this idea of people like snow cards. They're cool. I think the new frames are great too. You could actually just make a cube and just, shuffle in whatever, figure out what the Asfan is, but shuffle in a bunch of snow basics and force players to draft basics. That could be interesting.
Right, you definitely could. I'm sure people have done that. I think the thing you run up against there is that in order for the cards to still be appealing enough to be drafted in a cube where you're also drafting snow basics, first of all, you have to be really committed to snow. It has to be like a snow-themed environment. It can't just be like a couple of snow cards you like. But then also, that really forces your hand for the balance of the environment. It has to be a snow environment where this huge number of snow cards are all mutually playable, which really limits the other kinds of cards you can play. You can't play a more powerful card you like, because then people are just going to ignore the snow and play these more powerful cards, and it just kind of really, I think, ties your hands a little bit for what you can do if you want to play them like that.
Yeah, that's fair.
I did have a thought when the snow duels were spoiled, and we basically just got enter the battlefield, tap snow duels. They are fetchable, though, so they do have the basic land types. And when these were spoiled, it did occur to me that I think my perfect world for snow would be if they basically came out with snow shock lands, which I wouldn't like for all of the sort of bigger picture reasons I just explained why I don't really like snow. But in my cube exactly, I think it'd be very cool to play the snow cards with regular basics, but maybe like 3 cycles of snow shocklands, right? So there's a lot of snow fixing running around. You have all the fetch lands to go get your snow shocklands, so the fetch lands basically become snow lands as well. I think with that, you could totally justify playing some of the snow cards I do wish I could play. Things like Arkham's Astrolabe is a card I would really happily run in my cube. It's the kind of card I really like. A little cantrip that gives you some extra value, gives you a little artifact in play to do something with. But I'm not willing to play snow basics so I can play Arkham's Astrolabe. But if Arkham's Astrolabe basically said can only be cast with mana from non-basic lands or whatever, that would be a very cool way to do it, I think.
Oh, that could be interesting.
I also like that it would encourage people to draft more fixing for another reason, which I think is kind of cool. But yeah, snow's back, and I'm not happy about it. I don't like snow, and the thing I dislike most about that God card I read earlier is that it has this whole line about snow, which will be total distraction text in my cube because I will not play snow basics. So that's the first line of rules text on the card, is a big sentence that does not matter at all, which I loathe. So
yeah, one day we should do an episode about that exactly.
Yes, I agree. We can do an episode about added distraction eventually, but for now, just snow. Yuck. Ugh. Don't like it.
All right, I'll be a foil. I think this is going to be great in limited. Snow's cool.
If we get to draft this set in person, I'll be excited about it, because I did like the snow decks in Modern Horizons. I thought that was a very cool mechanic there. And yeah, when you have to draft your basics, it does make it really interesting and introduces a new level to the draft. But for Constructed, for bigger picture Magic, I think it's toxic, not good. All right, Anthony, we're done being negative, though, because next up is Sagas, a card I love. We have more Sagas back.
Well, this is an easy one. Everyone knows and loves Sagas. Literally, no one has anything bad to say about them.
Sagas do tend to be pretty beloved. And how much of that do you think is attributable to the fact that the very radically different card frame, which is vertical with vertical art and like a vertical column for text, is just pretty nice looking and people like it? How much of that is why Sagas are beloved, do you think?
That's huge. The fact that they are, very flavorful, both in the individual sagas and just the way that they work. It's like, here's the card, it's telling a story. That's extremely resonant and effective. And they do cool stuff.
Sagas were introduced first in Dominaria, and it's a enchantment type that has some number of chapters, usually 3, sometimes fewer, sometimes more, that when you play the enchantment, you get the first chapter immediately as an effect, so it's like an enchantment with an ETB, and then you have further chapters that happen at the beginning of your main phase, as you mentioned earlier, Anthony, beginning of your first main phase of your turn. So basically, the origin of this card type is actually, this is the way they initially designed Planeswalkers, which I'm sure you know, Anthony, because we're both listeners to Drive to Work, but this is how Planeswalkers were initially envisioned when they were designing Planeswalkers, and the reason they didn't do them this way is because they felt like the locked-in chapters often made the Planeswalker make like a seemingly stupid decision. It was like, why did this Planeswalker just do this effect that is not relevant of his board state at all? Because it makes him look like a dumb Planeswalker, and because the Planeswalkers are kind of the main characters of Magic, they didn't want these cards to end up looking dumb. So a good way to think about the Sagas ends up being that they're basically Planeswalkers with prescribed scripts where they have to do these certain number of things and they go to the graveyard, as opposed to giving you the choice. Yeah,
and it's the aspect of that's just so cool to me is that flavor is so important. Like, even if you're a real spike and you think, I don't need the pictures, I don't need the fancy names, just give me numbers and rules. Really, almost no one fits in that category. The flavor really helps you sort of accept and understand the way that the cards work in a very fundamental way.
Yeah, so the flavor of Sagas, which was introduced again in Dominaria, is basically that each one tells a story from the past. And so because it's a story from the past, of course it's not going to change in the middle, and like you can't just like remix it and start doing improv and like doing chapters out of order. The things happen in a certain order, and usually they do have a very kind of strong story that the actual card tells. Card like the first Eroan Games like is a kind of top-down design about Olympic parody, basically an Olympic analogy, which makes a little like competitor, and then they train and get better, and then they draw cards, which I'm not sure what that means in the analogy. Then they get a gold medal at the end. They get a little treasure token. So I am excited to see Sagas back. This is an example of a card type. I don't have any Sagas currently in my cube. There's some that do get played in Legacy, powered cubes pretty often, but I right now don't have any. We talked about modality. I really like giving players choices, and for all that I love Sagas, they don't give players choices. It's basically cast this card and hope these chapters, ride out and work out for you. And so I end up not including them because even though cards like the First Eroan Games or History of Benalia are really good rates for their effect, I don't like that they oftentimes give your opponent the option or ability to kind of fizzle a big portion of the card's value with a well-placed spell or something. So I love these cards, even though I don't end up playing them. I like them for all the other reasons, which, I don't know. There's lots of things to love about Magic.
I think that's a nice sort of like foil to a lot of modality, though. To like say, in sort of a small subset of games, there's going to be this little bit of prescriptive, the next couple turns are likely going to play out this way. I think that gives a nice structure to a lot of games.
Yeah, and I think this mechanic interacts, really, I think, especially Foretell and Sagas, also somewhat the Boast cards, but these mechanics, I think, do relate to each other in very interesting ways, in that Foretell says, like, I'm going to plan to do this in the future, and I got to plan which of my Foretell cards I'm going to do in the future and decide which one I need to do. Sagas basically lay out the next couple turns for you to some degree. Not the entire turn, obviously, but they basically lock in certain effects that are going to happen at certain times. And I think that there is going to be a very kind of like tempo-focused feeling to this limited environment where you're basically trying to get all of these effects to happen in the right order and on the right turn, and like sequencing is going to be really important in this set, because all of these mechanics kind of relate to sequencing. Even Boast to a certain degree, where it's like you're going to get your Boast creature down early. If they have a Boast effect, you're going to try and trigger on a certain turn, and it's all going to, I think, relate in a really cool way. The last actual returning mechanic is Changeling, which is the mechanic that basically says any card with Changeling is every creature type. How do you think about Changeling returning, Anthony?
I'm excited. Selfishly, I was hoping it to come back in black, but I think it's still possible we'll get a couple artifact creatures or maybe a couple black Changelings here or there. Changeling's cool. I mean, we've talked about Tribal a little bit in the past, or a lot, and how it sort of has this issue of working on exactly one axis, and Changeling is just a way to sort of open it up into letting things operate in a few different axes at the same time.
Yeah, when we talked about Tribal Mechanics a few episodes back, and when we saw the very first card spoiled for Kaldheim was the box topper Realm Waker, which is a Changeling. So it was the first mechanic we saw was Changeling from the set. I did start puttering around with a Tribal Cube list myself, which really ended up kind of committing to the tribal thing you talked about in Modern Horizons, where, Modern Horizons had things like Aeola, Queen of Bears, and what's another ridiculous tribal card from Modern Horizons? Can you think of one off the top of your head?
It had all the sliver cards and also the Savannah Lion Lord that gives all your creatures +2/+1.
Yeah, there were a couple other of weird Lord cards in Modern Horizons, which I think, big picture was them trying to get more tribal support printed for EDH and stuff, so people could build their Bear EDH deck or whatever. But the way they made it work in Limited was really brilliant, I think, which is that there was a certain density of Changelings, so that if you got any of these Lords, you knew that the Changelings were going to work to support that Lord. So there was not a density of Bears in Modern Horizons to make Aeola viable, but there was enough Changelings that if you got an Aeola early, you would basically prioritize the Changelings more later in the draft. And so I'm puttering with a cube list that is a lot of weird esoteric tribal cards and a high density of Changelings to basically allow you to turn these cards into like little mini tribal payoffs in decks that don't have, or in an environment that doesn't have enough, slivers or bears or whatever to make that kind of tribe actually work. So I'm really excited about the Changeling cards we're seeing here. Changeling is this mechanic that has, from the cube design perspective, I think it has suffered a bit with the periods in history in which it was printed, which is to say that we have Changelings in Kaldheim, we have Changelings in Modern Horizons, and then going all the way back to Lorwyn, we have more Changelings. Those are the only sets we've gotten them in. And the R&D of Magic back when Lorwyn was printed was just, creatures were a lot worse back then. And so these Changelings don't really interact with each other, for the most part, in reasonable balanced ways. The ones from Modern Horizons and Kaldheim are pretty well in balance with each other, but the ones from Lorwyn are just a lot worse, which, if you're designing a tribal mechanic or a tribal cube or a Changeling cube, is a hurdle that has to be kind of dealt with.
Yeah, I wonder if there's also constructed implications, like maybe that the tribal deck could actually be like a really, really powerful constructed deck that they have to sort of take into account and balance things.
Yeah, it's entirely possible that was one of the considerations back when lore was printed. I mean, now that we're in modern Magic power level times, the Changeling cards are really great, and it makes some of the old ones from Lorwyn look just quite awful. That's the kind of end of the actual formal mechanics of Kaldheim, but I did want to talk about runes really quick, Anthony. Have you seen any of these rune cards?
I've seen just the blue one. Are there more than that?
We've only seen the actual blue rune, but we have seen that one rune payoff. So it seems like basically we're getting a new subtype of aura, and we don't really know yet exactly what's going to define that subtype. I happen to think it's going to be a cheap aura that cantrips. Some people think it's going to be auras that can enchant any kind of permanent and have certain effects, whether they're enchanting creatures or equipment to then equip to those creatures. We'll see when we see more runes, but I think this mechanic, if it ends up being that they're small auras that cantrip, then I'm pretty excited about the mechanic. I think that's what it's going to be, and I think they are going to all enchant permanents, because that basically allows you to just turn your aura that might be dead in your hand if you have nothing to enchant viably into a cantrip. If you can just throw your aura on a land, who cares? It doesn't have an effect. It's just a cheap aura that lets you draw a card, which basically gives them all kind of pseudo-cycling. I think that's a very cool space to play in. I love cheap cards that cantrip and have some interesting effect, and I love any way to make auras more playable, because they are historically a very risky card type for a lot of reasons.
I mean, this first one at least is just extremely resonant, and in this sort of like ancient Norse, or like, it just puts me right into Skyrim immediately. It's 2 mana for an enchant permanent. You can either enchant your creature directly to give it flying, or you can enchant your equipment, and then the equipped creature has flying. So it's just sort of like a slightly more powerful, what is it, Gift of Wings? I could be wrong about that card. But like this idea of enchanting your armor to make it more powerful is really cool.
Yeah, and I also really like that, again, if you have no equipment and have no creature, you could just enchant your land, and nothing happens, right? Your land doesn't gain flying, but it has enchant permanence. You can just throw that thing on a land, draw your card, move on with the game, which does negate a lot of the downside of auras that are typical. So I think this is very cool. I expect we're going to get a cycle maybe of like one in each color, possibly, is what I'm like maybe guessing right now, but I think it's a very cool idea, and I'm excited to see more of those, even though it was not officially flagged as a mechanic in the set.
Yeah, I mean, just because something doesn't have a name doesn't mean it's not a mechanic. To reference Drive to Work the second time, it was interesting. Mara was talking at some point about an older set that people were all confused. They were like, well, why doesn't the set have any mechanics? And it clearly had a bunch of, cards that worked in specific ways, but they just didn't put a keyword on it because it wasn't necessary. And people were a little bit thrown off. So it's definitely, I'd for sure call it a mechanic.
Sure, I agree. Do you have any thoughts about this set overall to kind of close out the episode?
Well, we have a couple other little sort of mechanics that we haven't talked about.
By all means, take
one
it
of
away.
the ones that I think is very cool, which we've seen pop up a couple times in recent sets, is these sort of variations on living weapons. So we have, I think maybe it's a cycle of equipment that all have a kicker, or not a kicker cost, an enter the battlefield ability that lets you pay to make a token and attach it to it, which I think is very cool.
Yeah, you're right. Those are some cards we've seen. The ones we've seen are pretty overcosted, I think. I mean, certainly compared to stuff we've gotten in relatively recent sets like Ancestral Blade, which is just the 2-mana short sword that comes with a 1/1 attached to it. I really like that card. I think that card's brilliant and well-balanced. And all of these other ones, like, really it's like the equip costs on the equipment is pretty incredibly steep for the ones we've seen. And so it really doesn't read as super modal to me because you're going to be really unhappy to play any of these equipment out and then pay the 3 or 4 mana equip cost to equip them to another creature. You're just basically waiting till you can get to the point that you can pay for that triggered ability, which again plays just like Kicker. So I think it looks more modal than it actually is based on how the cards are balanced, but certainly a cool mechanic that it's equipment that does come with a body.
Yeah, I think even at pretty low power levels, like there aren't a ton that of these actual cards that I think are going to make it into my cube or any cubes I'm tinkering with, but I'm just excited to see them continue working in that space.
No Ancestral Blade, though. Ancestral Blade is great.
Yeah. The other thing we got that I think is brand new is lands with an off-color activation.
There's never been lands with an off-color activation before?
I could be wrong about that. Somebody who's screaming at their podcast tweeted me.
I feel like I'm going to think about it while you're talking about these cards, because I feel like you got to be wrong. Go ahead, explain these cards, though.
So we have this cycle of lands, including Axguard Armory. It's basically a white land, comes into play tapped, but has the ability you can pay 1 red, white, sacrifice it, search your library for an aura card or an equipment card, and put it into your hand. And I think this is the first time we've seen this lands with an ability that doesn't cost that color that is not also a dual land. It's interesting that I still only want to put this into a 2-color deck, so it's effectively just a Boros card. But I always love lands that have these like late game abilities. I just think they give you a lot of flexibility to have some interesting play late game and not taking up another spell slot. You basically just get one more effect in your deck. So I'm curious about these. I think the fact that they are basically gold cards means I won't end up queuing any of them, but I'm curious to see how they play out.
I think they're really cool, and they are kind of reminiscent of the Memorials from Dominaria, which were a very similar kind of cycle of cards, but in just monocolor. Now that we're saying this, there's a lot of kind of weird callbacks to Dominaria. We got the Sagas. I wonder if, do you think they were working on designing this set right when Dominaria came out and was so warmly received by everybody? Is that timeline matchup?
I think it does, yeah. Maybe?
Either way, I think these cards are very cool, and some of them I think are quite powerful. The effects we're seeing are pretty fairly costed, I think, for what you're getting. If you're playing an environment that has a higher tolerance for tap lands than my own, I think a lot of these cards could definitely get there for people, because it's a low cost to include a quite powerful effect in your deck for the late game. This set is weird, Anthony. I feel like it's very strange.
How so?
I just feel like a lot of the cards are very odd. I gotta say, especially many of the gods we've seen, the modal double face gods, just read like a wall of confusing text that I have to read 3 or 4 times to understand, and the sides don't seem to relate to each other almost at all. Like, I'm sure it's informed by mythology in a way that I am missing because I don't know these stories, but the actual cards themselves, a lot of them are very odd, I think, and I think this set's going to be pretty interesting the way it plays in Limited.
I don't know. At the same time, I think there have been some, this is the stuff that I really like. There have been some changes to the way they've been templating cards, which I think actually make a lot of these cards more readable.
How do you mean?
I can't think of any specifically.
All right, we'll be on the lookout for that then. Well, this has been Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in for our first look at Kaldheim. I hope this discussion of the mechanics and how they interact with one another and other mechanics in Magic's history, and how you might incorporate them into your own cubes or other Magic projects was helpful and informative. We'll be sending out our survey for this set as soon as the full spoiler is up, what is the date on that? I think it's going to be like the end of next week or something, so that's coming up. Make sure you are subscribed to our email newsletter if you are not already, to make sure you get linked to that survey so we can fill it out. And then after our survey, we might do a sort of more full episode dedicated to specific cards and our evaluations of them, a little less broad than this episode was. Any closing thoughts, Anthony?
I have no closing thoughts. I'm excited to start drafting the hell out of the set on Arena.
Nice. Maybe I'll try Arena again. I don't like spending money on digital video games. I have a hard time doing it.
It's so much less satisfying, to be honest, than playing with my friends in real life, but yeah, it's still Magic.
Thank you to DJ James Nasty for producing all of our music. Thanks to you for listening, and thank you, Anthony, for talking about Magic with me.
Anytime, Andy. Love to talk about Magic.
It's the greatest thing to talk about. Much better than politics.